Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. What is serendipity? You put your hand in your pocket and you discover a $20 bill that you thought you'd lost. You go down a street you've never walked before and you discover a beautiful park. Or maybe you're at a party and you meet someone special who becomes the love of your life. When we think of serendipity, many of us may think of those happy, unexpected occurrences that can happen in life. But what about the role of serendipity in other areas of our life? Our online life, for example. What does it mean when unexpected moments of discovery happen or don't happen when we're engaged online? How important is this? This is something Annabelle Kwan-Hass has thought a lot about. She's a professor of sociology and information media studies at Western University, and she joins us. Hi, Annabelle.
Oh, hello, Mary.
Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited about this discussion. I wanted to start off and ask you, what is your definition of serendipity? How do you see it?
Yes, there's been a lot of, a lot of debate around the term. And what's interesting is that serendipity is a term that doesn't really exist in other languages. So, I mean, I'm a multilingual. So, if I think of German or Spanish, there is really no word for serendipity that translates well. And the reason is because serendipity is a unique word. It was kind of coined fairly recently, on a trip by an English writer. And so that's why it doesn't really have the kind of usual Greek and Latin roots. And well, why does this matter to our definition? Well, a lot of the definitions we see in dictionaries actually don't really translate well to the original use of the word. Because in the original, when Walpole used serendipity, he kind of thought of it as not just being merely like kind of accidental where you stumble open something, but he actually used the word sagacity, which is often missing in dictionary definitions today. So when I define myself serendipity, I do include that sagacity. So it's not something really that is just about randomness. Randomness is, if we both were wearing now the same shirt, that'd be pretty random, right? It would be kind of like a coincidence. Whereas when I think of the word serendipity, to me, it means kind of the ability to make that connection, the ability to kind of use your past knowledge, your understanding, your experience to make sense of something new that you hadn't thought of, that you were not looking for. But that once you see it, you recognize it because of that kind of past knowledge. You were maybe even kind of waiting for it. You didn't know it existed. But when you see it, you kind of recognize that. You kind of slowly start making sense of it. And then, as you said, I like the way you said it. It kind of leads to a happy outcome, to something positive most of the time.
I see. Now, when you were talking about your interpretation of serendipity, that's so interesting because to me, I hear a researcher talking. Right? Because what you say, I could totally see applies to research, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. No. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of discoveries in science, in history, and in humanities that are based on serendipity. And, to me, it's really interesting because in research and academia, we don't tend to reflect enough or a lot or write about how we come to discover something. The reason is because scientists, researchers, are busy people. We're always looking for the next big project, the next big discovery. And what that means, though, is that it doesn't leave a lot of space for the kind of reflection, for the kind of writing about what we do. So
that is so true. Yeah, because when I think of it, because I've read a lot of research, I interview so many researchers, and then so often I will see so-and-so discovered this by accident.
Yeah.
And then that's pretty much it. Like there's not the how it happened, why he noticed this, how he was open to this accidental discovery. You're right.
Yeah. And there's a number of factors that come into play here. One is, as I said, scholars are very busy. They're always, looking for the next funding for the next big project. There's a lot of demands on academics. But the other thing is, Mary, also a lot of the work that happens today is kind of within a black box, right? There's so much controversy around patents, copyright. So people may not really want to make it that transparent as to, well, how did they reach that discovery? What were the steps behind it? And so there's a little bit of kind of that mystery about, how do discoveries happen? And I think that's, it's really a loss to our knowledge around, how research occurs, because we often think of research as very linear, very planned, like the person already knew what they would be finding. But in reality, the lab looks very different. And I think some of the most important discoveries, like, for example, penicillin, happened somewhat accidentally. And they really, have kind of in important ways, changed, medicine, made such a big difference in so many people's lives.
Yeah. But why are you so personally interested in serendipity?
Well, to me, there's a number of things. First of all, it really started also with our love of libraries. So we got really interested in serendipity because we were curious about, well, how do people make choices around books when they're in a library? And, this could be anyone, any patron, you go into a library, you find a book you weren't really looking for, like, how do you find that next big, book that you really are eager to read, and what does it lead to, right? So that was our initial thought. But then as we read more about it, we kind of realized that, the digital environments in which we kind of live more or less, spend a lot of time today, also have that kind of component, of, where if you do a search on a search engine, there isn't really a lot of serendipity happening because you kind of already know what you're looking for. You put in that search string and it leads you to a certain set of findings. And let's admit it, most of us, we don't go past the first one or two, hits the pages. So we kind of felt that maybe there was something there where, potentially digital environments really kind of changed the way that everyday users, but also scholars, you really approach the research processes.
Yeah. So if we were to translate or sort of take that same idea, now we're looking at all of us, right? And we're online and we're doing our searches because we're interested in some specific idea. Let's say it's related to schoolwork or it's related to our work or just read anything in our personal life. What happens to, I mean, you touched on it, but then what happens to that serendipitous moment, right? When we're online and we're doing these kinds of searches, what happens to us?
Well, and that is kind of what I think can be worrisome, is that we're also focused on the effectiveness of search. And I think most of the time, we're very happy with that because, if I'm trying to find out at what time the train leaves from London to Toronto, I just want to find that information. I'm very task oriented. But I think what happens is that we kind of lose the balance between discovery and task oriented, kind of moments. So we're kind of favoring the task oriented moments where we know what we're looking for. We want to do it effectively. And we're not giving enough time to the discovery and exploration. So, and that really limits what we know about ourselves, about the world in so many ways, because search engines know us really well. I mean, that's the other thing that is really important here, Mary, is that search engines know our past history. They know our past search behavior. So they tend to give us, the information and the hits that kind of reflect that reflect our likes. So I really feel like that can change a lot about how much we know about ourselves and the world, just because we're always so limited to finding what we're looking for rather than really expanding our knowledge base and kind of expanding our experiences. And, there may be so much out there that may be relevant or interesting to us that we don't know about, but there's no way of us really encountering it.
I find that, ironic because, I mean, when potentially the internet can offer us more information than we've ever had before. And yet, on the other hand, it's now limiting us. It's limiting our exposure, our chance for discovery.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, though, is, and that's important to realize, that when we train graduate students, whether it be in history or in other areas, we train them to also do some of the serendipity. So when we interviewed history professors, they thought that training students to kind of encounter serendipity is an important part of history training. And it's very hard to train for something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it just kind of demonstrates that, as a scholar, when we train our graduate students or undergraduate students as well, we train them to not just kind of narrowly funnel into a topic, but we really want them to have an initial stage, before you kind of determine your topic, of exploration, where you got to open up, you got to be very open to a topic and to kind of exploring the periphery of the topic, right? Like rather than narrowing down right away on a single issue. And so I think that what we found in some of the research is that, postgraduate students actually spend a lot of time online just exploring. And in some of the studies, it was up to an hour a day. Now, we may think, well, maybe they're wasting their time, right? I mean, you may kind of think, well, what could you be doing an hour on social media? Just kind of looking at anything that pops up. But from these interviews, this is a UK study, what became really clear was that the postgraduate students saw this as really relevant. And even though they said, well, there's a lot of noise out there on social media, so there's a lot of irrelevant information, they still felt that emerging in that, the few instances of serendipity that they had were so valuable to their work, and they were so relevant to either changing the direction of their study or, having them find information or results that they weren't aware of that really kind of changed maybe the focus, that for them, it was worth it. So they felt that the effort that they put into the kind of open exploration was relevant. Like it was relevant in a way that, made them realize that they wanted to go back and wanted to continue with that exploration frequently.
Wow, that's fascinating because, I can also see that when you do something like that, there's a bit of risk involved, right? Because you don't know if you're going to necessarily come up with something valuable or that might help you in your work or your project, right? You just have to kind of be open to that possibility happening, but it's not a guarantee.
Well, and that's what the students said. So they talked a lot about this, this kind of balance between effort and outcome. So they never wanted to spend too much time on it because they realized that there was no certainty in a positive outcome. So that, very often there was no serendipitous encounter. So, the time was, it was time that while it may have been a little bit useful, it wasn't really relevant to moving the research forward.
Right.
But at the same time, they saw serendipity so valuable that they were willing to have that extra time on the platform, just because they knew that when they did have that serendipitous encounter, it was so relevant that, it made it worth spending the time online.
Okay, that's postgraduate students you're talking about.
Yes.
But what about, young people in general and how they use social media and, depending also on the platforms they're using? I mean, what happens to serendipity there and what kind of information are they getting back?
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I think we see that in some ways we don't really know enough about that. So I feel like, I wish I could say a lot more about it, but, a lot of these platforms are governed by very complex, algorithms. And so I think we know that, they often try to build in features like discoverability, where you can connect to new influencers, you can connect to new topics. But to some extent, a lot of, Instagram, let's say, is really geared towards trying to figure out who you are as a person. And I found that a lot on Pinterest. So I'm a lot on Pinterest, and it kind of frustrates me sometimes because, Pinterest has put me in certain bins, right? The algorithm has put me into, she loves design and she loves, vegan food. So it keeps providing me that kind of information, which is nice. Right. I'm happy, right? Like it kind of knows what I like. But honestly, I'm a lot more than just those two groups. Like I have a lot more interest and I would like to discover a lot more things. So I find that sometimes the algorithms, based on past searches, on past behaviors, on who we're connected to, tend to give us more of what we like, and that make us happy. But it may also really narrow our possibilities for identity exploration, for growth, to kind of reinventing ourselves. Maybe I want to not look at design anymore. Maybe I want to do something different in my life. So I feel like the algorithms can kind of close us in, box us in ways that we may not even be aware of. So we may not even realize how we've been categorized and in what groupings we've been put and how that impacts what we see. And so we may be happy, right? We may be very content because we're getting more of what we already like, or more of similar opinions that we may have, on a political basis, which may kind of confirm our opinions and biases potentially, but it doesn't really give us enough room for growth, for encountering new things. So that to me is where I see some of these platforms as really being kind of problematic.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, when you bring up about perhaps, confirming opinions we have and sort of narrowing our world perspective, do you feel that we can get into actually dangerous territory there when we just keep getting, with the echo chambers, right? We keep getting the feedback and reinforcing views, and perhaps sometimes those views might be harmful or dangerous.
Yeah, I think that I've seen quite a bit of that, and I think there's two problems here. One problem is that in general, people are starting to trust, information less, right? So there's a general kind of decline in trust, let's say, in traditional news, in governments, in pharmaceuticals. And there have been sufficient, like scandals and problems that kind of have led to that kind of mistrust. But I think what happens, though, at the same time is that I think we're seeing kind of an increase in what we call in information science, opinion. So what is filling that void? So people are maybe moving away from, the traditional news or, traditional kind of gatekeepers. And they're moving toward more influencers, people that have opinions, but they have a hard time differentiating between what is news and what is facts, what is science, and what is opinion. And online, there certainly is kind of that difficulty of distinguishing, when has something been fact checked and when is something a personal opinion. And so that is, I think, where these two factors come in together. So when somebody curates, so we call it usually the curation, of your profile or of your account. So you're curating your profile by adding, by following other accounts, or by adding people, on Facebook that you like. And what happens is that something that we call homophily kicks in. So, usually we try to associate, and this happens offline, as well as online, but we try to associate people that are more like us, that think more like us, that look more like us, because that's what comfortable, that's what we're familiar with.
Yeah. And that's so kind of our tribe. It's sort of our tribe.
Oh, absolutely. And it totally makes sense. Just think of age, right? Like young people want to associate with young people because that's, they have similar
common interests, sure, activities. Yeah,
totally. So, and that recreates online. So homophily is, very strong. So you start following people that are like you, that have similar, ideas, similar interests. But if you combine that now with these strong algorithms that put you in these boxes and with this confounding of opinion and facts, that is, I think, where, as you were saying, I see a lot of the problems, where people have the confirmation of their ideas. And then, the more, I call it going down the rabbit hole, the more you go down the rabbit hole, the more you have people who kind of agree with you, who confirm that. And that makes it really difficult to kind of, look at it more from a critical point of view.
It makes me wonder too, then, if that's the case and people have fewer of those serendipitous moments, right? But more feedback that confirms what they think and what they believe. The more you do that, do you think the less open you are when those serendipitous moments actually do come up?
Well, Mary,
because you might ignore them, right? You might ignore them. You might not even recognize them.
Well, and there's a study that looked at that, and I thought it was really interesting because, originally when we talked about polarization, which is that you have two different networks, talking about two different points of view, and there's very little overlap. And so that's kind of what we call the echo chamber, right? Like you're
Right.
looking at two networks, they're each have their own point of view because they never talk to each other, they never challenge each other. But interestingly enough, this study looked at what happens when you get information that challenges your view, and which is kind of that could be that serendipitous moment, right? You encounter something that you weren't expecting. But it turns out that just further confirms your opinion. So we're not seeing, as we would expect, that would challenge, your ideas. It's quite the opposite. It kind of solidifies your ideas further. So that is worrisome because it kind of questions, well, how do we get out of our own biases? Like how do we become self-aware of our biases and hopefully, fact check them, try to figure out, look at it from different angles, right? Like that's, I think, what is missing here.
Yeah. And I'm interested knowing as well with your research and what you discovered regarding how people use social media and, kind of the optimum way to, as you say, right? There are certain things you need to know and you need to find out, but then you're still open to serendipity and moments of discovery and learning new things that maybe you weren't originally thinking you were looking for. Like, what did you find from your research about how people use social media?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting there is that, we found that people are very different in how they use social media. I mean, we often think of, how much can you do on social media? But we actually investigated undergraduate students. So we did a large scale study of undergraduate students and asked them, what do you do when you're on Twitter? What are kind of the, online behaviors? What is the kind of engagement that you have? And then we asked them as well, what kinds of experiences do you have? Have you encountered information? Was it valuable? How was it used in your research? And what we found was that, students who engaged more, so who did more things on Twitter, so they posted more, they retweeted more, they searched more, so they had kind of like a deeper engagement with the social media environment. Those were the students who were most likely to have a serendipitous encounter when on Twitter. Whereas those people who engaged less, who maybe lurked more, were much less likely to have that. So what we concluded is that, active engagement, rather than just kind of passive scrolling, is what can lead to the most, to the most, likely occurrences or encounters with serendipity when you're on social media.
Now, do you think that would extend beyond young people? What about older people and engagement online there?
Well, we actually did a study where we looked at a community in Toronto. So we studied East York. Maybe you're familiar with East York. We love East York. So and when we looked at East York, we found that when we looked at older adults, so this is 65 plus, not all retired, I must say. East Yorker older adults are very active. They're engaged in a lot of volunteering. They're doing, a lot of socializing. So this was a very active group of older adult East Yorkers. But we found that they weren't all homogeneous. So when we looked at their digital media use, we found huge variation. So some were non-users, some were kind of, sporadic users. But then we found a group of savvy users and a group that we called go-getters. And they were very eager to be involved. They were constantly trying out new tools. Often, they were on Facebook. They were, using Skype, and they were very kind of active on all of these media. And they were the ones who got, the most benefits from using these environments. So they were able to, for example, schedule, their volunteer events. They were often able to manage, some of their social groups, their book clubs, coordinate events. They were really the ones who got the most benefits out of social media, including social benefits. So they would talk to family, for example, in the States, a lot of transatlantic communication, with the UK, India. So we really saw that, those individuals who were the most willing to try out new features, new platforms, had the greatest benefits.
Wow. And what about, I mean, we're still in the pandemic, but we've come off almost all restrictions. How do you feel that has changed the way we use social media, serendipitous moments, and whether these changes, if there are any, are permanent?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting because pre-pandemic, we certainly saw an increase in social media
Yeah.
use across all platforms. And then it plateaued a little bit just pre-pandemic. There wasn't a big growth on Facebook. But with the pandemic, suddenly we saw a drastic increase. And what's interesting here, Mary, is that it wasn't just that people were using social media more, but for example, when you look at kids, kids were using all platforms more. So all platforms, whether you look at, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it doesn't matter what platform, everything went up. But the other thing that was really interesting about the pandemic is that a new platform, TikTok, emerged. And if you look at it now, post-pandemic, TikTok has totally taken off. And I think when we talk about serendipity, to me, this is a response to the serendipity problem, because Instagram, and a lot of the other social media platforms hadn't really figured out how to do discovery well. Like their algorithms were really outdated in terms of, how to present information. And I think kind of my frustration with Pinterest really shows that, no? Because you kind of are put into certain boxes and then you see more of that. And, they're not sure, well, what else could we present this person, right? Like they have a hard time figuring you out. Like, who are you really? And how can we kind of help you, recreate yourself or kind of explore new areas of your identity? Whereas with TikTok, I think they were very clever in that their algorithm is much more discovery oriented, right? You never know what you'll see next. And combined with these really short, like it's a lot kind of faster environment, allows them, any one single user can see so much more content in a single minute. Like you can just be exposed to so much more diversity and you can get rid of what you don't like so much faster, that I think they really pinned down that serendipity element. And the pandemic was a time where a lot of people felt a loss of control, right? Like there was so much uncertainty. We didn't really know how long it would take. We didn't really know how we would get out of it. There was just kind of a lot of, anxiety around, what would happen next. So TikTok emerged as this kind of unique platform where not only are we connected to friends and we can share the videos with them and show them what we're looking at, but we're also discovering completely new content. So, for example, I ended up, doing a lot of baking. I think a lot of us did that, like
me too. Yeah.
making our own bread. Well, those are all things that maybe you wouldn't have thought of yourself, right? Like I wouldn't have come up with that idea. But the moment you see it, you're like, oh, I could do that. That looks like fun. So I think that serendipity component really solidified TikTok as one of the leading social media platforms. Absolutely.
I think what concerns me too now, though, is, as we move through this pandemic and big decisions are being made now about the workplace. And this is a question I probably ask almost every friend that I see, what's happening with your work? Are you going to be staying, completely remote? Are you doing a hybrid form? Are you going to go back full time? And most of the people, and this would only be within my circle, but most people who don't have to go into work physically, right, all the time, most of them say, well, I would prefer to do my work completely remote or maybe go in, once or twice a week. And it's about time, right? The time commuting. It's about efficiency. I get more done at home. It's all those things, but they never bring up, rarely do they bring up serendipity. And I just think, but as we've discussed, it's so important. But that's something maybe that a lot of people don't factor in to their work necessarily, because it's not measured in the end, right? As productivity. It's not measured.
Yeah, Mary, and it's interesting because a lot of the work in management, looking at organizations, has demonstrated that serendipity encounters, accidental encounters, on hallways, water coolers. That's kind of what solidifies the community and allows, for a lot of what we call tacit knowledge or understandings to actually kind of, become part of a deeper conversation. So I think that we spend so much time, in the past building these perfect buildings, right? That would increase serendipity, thinking about, well, how can we design the office in a way that people will stumble, open each other and have these casual conversations that will then, lead to these serendipitous moments where somebody tells you something or asks you a question and you go, oh, I hadn't actually thought of that. But that leads to an entire new kind of research direction. Or, I mean, that's happened so much, even at seminars and kind of similar events. So I really do wonder about whether that is being factored in enough. And I think that the serendipity is important because in work environments, it doesn't matter where you work, creativity, discovering new things, being excited about your work, all of that really matters so much. And the serendipity is such a happy moment, right? Like it's meant to be an aha moment, right? This, the moment of, I hadn't really connected those two things, or I hadn't realized this happens. And when we're missing all of that, I feel like there's also kind of something missing, exciting about our work. Now the question is, as we saw with the graduate student research earlier, can we recreate some of that online, right? So if your friends are staying at home, they're not going into the office, is it possible that they're having that online? Like, could we have people connected, with maybe more communities that are more like-minded, that are really working on what they're doing and where they're kind of building on each other? Can they recreate that? Is that
well?
Awesome.
Is that being thought of? Because I mean, as of kind of now, when I go on Zoom meetings, that doesn't really seem to be happening. I mean, the meetings I go on, they're pretty focused, right? And there are certain things that we have to get through and discuss. And it doesn't have that kind of, let's just kind of go here and go there and talk about whatever. That doesn't seem to be really happening. Maybe it is in other places. I don't know.
No, Mary, I think Zoom is not designed to, to have, like, Zoom wasn't designed with serendipity in mind. I mean, Zoom was designed with, effectiveness, being, quick meetings, effective teaching. For example, what I really missed about teaching online, and which is why I think so many universities are now back in person, and rather than saying, oh, well, we don't need, the in-person, is the chats before and after class. So, often when I'm in the classroom, I leave a lot of time that is just kind of thinking time, group discussion time. And the reason is because that's where a lot of this, aha moments, the new connections, the discovery, happen. So if we do it all on Zoom and we're so focused, as you said, on the tasks at hand, we're not leaving any room, for chat, where often the serendipity happens. Because serendipity, you can't program for it. That's the other thing that is so difficult about it. That is that you can't say, oh, well, now we're having our serendipity hour. Like, that's not.
I don't know. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, actually. You never know what might come out of a free-for-all discussion, right? That's actually kind of an interesting thing you just raised, Annabelle. Maybe we do need to have, and maybe it's even something where it is structured to a certain extent, because maybe the person who's leading the discussion will bring up other kinds of topics for engagement. Do you know what I mean? That are not necessarily related to the project at hand.
Well, and I don't know. When you look at the original, like, coining of the term serendipity, it was, I think, a dinner on a cruise ship. So they were just having like this very informal conversation. And when Walpole noticed the serendipity, he was really impressed because this person connected previously disconnected ideas, right? Like it's this ability to be in a conversation that is completely unrelated to anything and to all of a sudden go, oh, that just made me think of this. I just realized, this kind of like aha moment. So I think that's why it's so difficult to recreate, is because you never know when a piece of information, when something somebody says is relevant, right? Like that's so difficult. Like it's just, you can't program for it. And I think that's what we're missing, is that, I think that from an educator, like I'm an educator, right? And you got to always think of me as somebody who works with young people. And as an educator, to me, we don't want to just train the next generation as being skill oriented, right? We don't want kids of tomorrow to just have a predetermined set of skills and to be able to find information X and Y. Like we want to give them that ability to discover, to go broad, to take, to go into completely new directions. I think, and how do we teach that, right? Like how do we design our tools, create that awareness, that you need to be able to let go sometimes, right? To lower your anxiety, go to a new place, explore it, put your cell phone away, right? Like those kinds of things. I think that is where, I see the online offline balance, to be able to say, well, I'm going to I know now where I am approximately. I'm going to turn my cell phone off and I'm just going to let, the place take, the place take over and, for me to discover what's in it.
I couldn't agree more with everything you've said. And it's funny because even if I was just to take this interview as an example, if I already knew everything that you were going to say, that would be pretty boring for me. And, with moments that I remember in interviews like this one, it's when you said things that I didn't know. You came from sort of left field and said something, and it was like an aha moment. Oh my goodness, that is so startling or surprising, right? And it is almost kind of like a serendipitous moment. And those are the things I think that make the greatest impact with me and that stay with me. So, I mean, this interview is a good example of that.
Oh, well, thank you, Mary. And I think going back to where we started, the sagacity. And I think that's why, to me, having sagacity in the definition of serendipity is so important, is because...
And explain what sagacity is for people who don't know.
Oh, sagacity is kind of that, intellectual ability to make connections. So, and that's why it's, it's not random, right? It's not something that just happens randomly, because to me, that's where knowledge and understanding comes in, is that for a person to kind of make that connection. And I think you said it so nicely, Mary, where you said, well, that really made me have that aha moment, is because you were prepared for it, right? You had the knowledge, you had the understanding, you had already experienced maybe something where you traveled a certain way, or, where something happened. So when I said something new, you were able to bring what you already knew and make that connection. And for example, in the experiment on penicillin, that becomes so clear, because as a lay person, I would have never been able to recognize the importance of the discovery. As a lay person, you can't.
Right.
But when you have all that knowledge and understanding, when you see it, you recognize what it means, because you have the ability to make that connection with your existing body of knowledge. And that's why serendipity is so important, is because it allows you to recognize the importance of something that for other people, may not be relevant, because they don't bring that knowledge, that understanding to the situation.
Oh, it's a fascinating discussion, Annabelle. We could go on and on. We'll have to have you back again to discuss it further.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. It's been such a pleasure. And, it's been lovely chatting about serendipity and the research we do in the lab.
Best of luck on your research as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mary.
That's Annabelle Kwan-Haas. She's a professor of sociology and information media studies at Western University. And for more on Annabelle's work, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. And our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. You might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of a busy day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.